My beloved child, do not move past this moment too quickly, because something hidden has been shifting behind the silence, and what you are about to hear touches a part of your story you may have been trying to understand for longer than you admit. There is a reason certain things suddenly felt different. There is a reason someone who once seemed drawn toward you began hesitating, watching from a distance, questioning feelings that had once felt almost impossible to deny. Pause here for a moment, because the distance was not created only by uncertainty. Someone spoke into your soulmate's ear. Someone planted a warning. Someone told them to stay away from you. But what that person did not expect was that the truth would begin revealing itself piece by piece, and once your soulmate saw what had really happened, something inside them could no longer remain the same. You may have wondered why the energy changed so suddenly. One moment there was warmth, curiosity, an invisible pull that seemed to exist without effort. Then came hesitation. Replies became slower. Certain conversations stopped before reaching the place your heart believed they were meant to reach. There were moments when your soulmate wanted to come closer, yet something seemed to hold them back. You may have blamed yourself. You may have replayed old words, wondering whether you had spoken too much, revealed too much, cared too deeply, or somehow frightened away what felt meaningful. But there was another conversation taking place outside your awareness, and that conversation carried more influence than you realized. The person who warned them did not begin with an obvious attack. That would have been too easy to question. Instead, they spoke carefully. They used the language of concern. They made themselves appear protective. They said things that sounded reasonable enough to create doubt. They suggested that your soulmate should be careful with you. They hinted that you were not what you appeared to be. They implied there were pieces of your story that had not been revealed. And because your soulmate trusted this person, at least enough to listen, those words slipped into their mind like a shadow entering a room through a door left slightly open. At first, your soulmate resisted. Something inside them did not want to believe it. Their heart remembered the way your presence felt different. It remembered the strange calm that appeared when they thought about you. It remembered moments that seemed ordinary on the outside but somehow stayed with them afterward. They had tried to explain away that connection before. They called it curiosity. They called it timing. They called it coincidence. But deep inside, they knew your energy had reached a place others had never touched. So when they were told to stay away, one part of them immediately asked, "Why does this warning feel wrong?" Still, fear can become persuasive when it is repeated. The person continued. They brought up fragments, half-truths, misunderstandings, things taken out of context. They may have described your silence as secrecy, your boundaries as coldness, your strength as pride, your caution as manipulation. They took qualities shaped by everything you have survived and gave them darker names. And my child, this is where the story became painful, because your soulmate did not know enough yet to separate reality from interpretation. They were standing between what they felt in their heart and what someone else insisted they should believe. There came a moment when your soulmate almost listened completely. They considered stepping away. They considered convincing themselves that whatever existed between you was better left unexplored. They told themselves they were being sensible. They tried to treat distance as wisdom. They may even have acted colder than they truly felt because they were attempting to prove to themselves that the connection did not matter. But there was a problem the person who warned them had never anticipated. Distance did not erase you. It made certain truths louder. When your soulmate tried not to think about you, they noticed how often you returned to their mind. When they tried to dismiss your presence, memories became clearer. When they told themselves someone else's warning must be right, their own experiences with you began contradicting it. They remembered the way you responded during moments when you had nothing to gain. They remembered kindness you offered quietly. They remembered how you never needed an audience for the most genuine parts of your heart. And slowly, an uncomfortable question began forming inside them. What if I have been judging this person through someone else's fear? That question became the beginning of everything. Because once your soulmate asked it, they began observing differently. Instead of searching for reasons to distrust you, they started looking at the evidence for themselves. Not through gossip. Not through assumption. Not through somebody else's story. They watched your consistency. They noticed what happened when you were disappointed. They noticed how you carried yourself when misunderstood. They noticed that you did not chase every rumor trying to defend your name. And strangely, your refusal to perform for approval began telling them more about you than any explanation could have. There was something about your silence that disturbed the false story. Understand this carefully, beloved, truth does not always arrive shouting. Sometimes truth simply stands still long enough for confusion to exhaust itself. You may have wanted to explain everything. You may have imagined what you would say if you could sit across from your soulmate and finally tell them every detail. You may have wanted them to know why you responded the way you did, why certain walls existed, why you sometimes stepped back even when you cared deeply. Yet something prevented that conversation from happening too early. And perhaps that delay felt cruel. But it allowed your soulmate to discover something they needed to discover without being persuaded by you. They needed to choose what they believed. That choice became more difficult when another detail surfaced. Your soulmate heard something about you from a completely different source, someone who had no reason to protect your image and no connection to the person who had warned them. What they heard was small at first, almost insignificant, but it contradicted one of the strongest claims made against you. Your soulmate did not react outwardly. They simply listened. Yet inside, something shifted. If one part of the warning was wrong, what else had been distorted? From that day, curiosity became investigation. They began remembering exact words. They replayed the original warning in their mind. They noticed exaggerations they had overlooked before. The person who told them to stay away had spoken with certainty about things they could not possibly know firsthand. That realization bothered your soulmate. Why had they sounded so confident? Why had they been so invested in creating distance? Why did their supposed concern become strangely intense whenever your name came up? And then came another realization that your soulmate was not prepared for. The person warning them had their own emotional reason for wanting you removed from the picture. That reason was not immediately obvious. It may not have been romantic jealousy in the simple way people imagine. It could have been fear of losing influence. Fear that your soulmate would change. Fear that your presence would expose unhealthy patterns. Fear that your soulmate would become more independent once they felt genuinely understood by someone. Sometimes people do not oppose a connection because the connection is wrong. They oppose it because it threatens the role they have become comfortable playing. Your soulmate slowly began seeing this. They noticed how the warning person reacted whenever something good was said about you. A strange pause. A subtle change in tone. A dismissive joke. A quick attempt to redirect the conversation. Your soulmate began testing the pattern without even realizing it. They mentioned something kind you had done, and instead of acknowledging it, the person immediately searched for a negative interpretation. They mentioned that perhaps they had misunderstood you, and the response was almost defensive. That was when the first real alarm sounded inside your soulmate's spirit. Why would someone become upset at the possibility that you might actually be good? That question would not leave them. And while all this was unfolding, you were living your own side of the story without knowing how close the truth had come to the surface. There may have been nights when you felt a strange heaviness and could not explain it. Moments when you thought about your soulmate unexpectedly. Times when you sensed that something was happening beyond what you could see. You may have felt tempted to reach out, then stopped. Tempted to close the chapter, then something within you whispered that the story was not finished. Not because you should wait endlessly for another person, but because part of you sensed that the confusion surrounding this connection had not yet reached its conclusion. And it had not. Your soulmate began comparing the person you truly were with the version they had been warned about, and the two no longer matched. The warning said you were selfish, but your soulmate remembered moments when you gave without demanding anything back. The warning said you were dishonest, yet the things you had told them, even the difficult things, remained consistent over time. The warning said your intentions were questionable, but your actions were strangely free of the manipulation they had been told to expect. The more your soulmate looked, the more the story began collapsing. But the biggest revelation had not happened yet. There was one specific accusation, one particular detail that had influenced your soulmate more than all the others. It was the thing that made them step back hardest. The thing they kept returning to whenever they felt tempted to trust you. The person had told them something about your past, something presented as proof that you would eventually hurt them too. Your soulmate believed this information had come from a reliable source. They did not know that the story had been altered before it ever reached them. Then one day, almost unexpectedly, they heard the original version. And my child, the difference between what really happened and what they had been told left them stunned. The event from your past had not revealed cruelty. It revealed pain. It had not shown that you were incapable of loyalty. It showed how much loyalty had cost you. It had not proven that you abandoned people when things became difficult. It revealed that you had stayed far longer than most people knew, trying to repair something until staying began destroying your own peace. Your soulmate suddenly realized that the same story used to make you look dangerous actually showed how deeply you had once cared. Something inside them broke open. They felt guilt, not because they had intentionally harmed you, but because they had allowed somebody else to shape their perception without ever giving you the chance to speak for yourself. They remembered moments when you seemed confused by their distance. They remembered times when you tried to connect and they responded with caution you did not understand. They began seeing those memories from your side, and that perspective hurt. There was one memory in particular that returned with force. A moment when you had looked at them, spoken to them, or responded in a way that carried quiet sincerity, and they had doubted it because of what they had been told. At the time, they thought they were protecting themselves. Now they wondered whether they had been protecting themselves from the one person who may never have been trying to hurt them at all. That realization followed them into the night. They could not simply forget it. Your soulmate began asking themselves questions they had avoided for too long. What if I pushed away someone who was being genuine with me? What if the person I trusted was projecting something onto them? What if I allowed fear to make a decision my heart never agreed with? And then came the question that frightened them most. What if they no longer want me near them? That is where the emotional balance shifted. Before, you were the one left wondering. Now your soulmate began wondering about you. Before, you questioned why they pulled away. Now they questioned whether they had damaged something precious. Before, you felt the uncertainty of not knowing where you stood. Now they were beginning to feel the weight of not knowing whether the door they had neglected was still open. Do not misunderstand this as a promise that another person will return exactly as you imagine. This story is deeper than prediction. It is about what happens when truth enters a place previously controlled by fear. And the truth was doing something powerful inside your soulmate. It was making avoidance impossible. They could no longer hear your name casually. Every mention carried history. Every memory carried a question. Every moment of distance now had a reason they wanted to examine. But heaven was not finished revealing what had happened behind the scenes. Because while your soulmate was beginning to realize the warning had been distorted, the person who warned them sensed the shift too. They noticed your soulmate asking different questions. They noticed that the old arguments no longer worked as easily. They noticed that when your name was mentioned, your soulmate did not immediately agree with the criticism anymore. Something had changed in their eyes. And people who build influence through misinformation often become nervous when the person they influenced begins thinking independently. So they tried one more time. This time, the warning became stronger. They told your soulmate that getting closer to you would be a mistake. They insisted that your soulmate was becoming emotionally blinded. They framed themselves as the only person willing to tell the truth. But instead of working, the intensity exposed something. Your soulmate asked a simple question. How do you know? There was a pause. A longer pause than there should have been. The answer came, but it was vague. A reference to something someone supposedly said. A claim that had passed through multiple people. Nothing solid. Nothing your soulmate could verify. And for the first time, they looked at the person not as a protector, but as someone whose motives needed examining. That moment changed the atmosphere completely. The person who warned them realized they were losing control of the story. They became emotional, perhaps irritated, perhaps unusually defensive. They may have accused your soulmate of choosing you over people who truly cared. But that reaction only pushed the truth further into the light. Genuine concern does not need control. Genuine concern can tolerate questions. Genuine concern does not fear evidence. Your soulmate saw the difference. And then they did something they had avoided doing from the beginning. They defended you. Not dramatically. Not yet. But they said enough. They said, that has not been my experience with them. Those words may seem small, but spiritually and emotionally, they represented a turning point. Your soulmate was no longer borrowing somebody else's perception of you. They were reclaiming their own. And once they did that, memories began aligning in a completely different way. They remembered the times you gave them room instead of pressuring them. They remembered how you respected boundaries even when you could have demanded answers. They remembered how, despite confusion, you did not try to turn everyone against them. They remembered an unexpected kindness, a sentence you spoke casually, a moment you may have forgotten but they never did. It was something you said when there was nothing romantic to gain. Something about wishing them peace. That memory hit differently now. Because manipulative people rarely wish you peace when peace might lead you away from them. Your soulmate began realizing that one of the things they had interpreted as emotional distance from you may actually have been respect. You were not always holding back because you did not care. Sometimes you were holding back because you refused to force what needed to be chosen freely. And suddenly, they understood you in a way they never had before. The understanding brought tenderness. Then regret. Then urgency. They wondered how many times you had gone home carrying questions because of a battle you did not even know existed. They wondered whether you sensed their mistrust. They wondered if they made you feel as though you had to prove your worth when the accusation against you was never yours to carry in the first place. Something in them wanted to reach out immediately. But another fear appeared. What could they possibly say? How do you tell someone, I allowed another voice to become louder than my own experience of you? How do you admit that you stepped away because of things you now know were incomplete? How do you return to a person whose heart you may have confused without reopening wounds? So your soulmate hesitated again, but this hesitation was different. Before, they hesitated because they doubted you. Now they hesitated because they were beginning to doubt whether they deserved your trust. And my beloved child, this is where you must hear something important for your own heart. You do not need to become smaller to make someone else's return easier. You do not need to erase what hurts simply because they finally understand. Truth may open a door, but healing decides how that door is entered. If there is ever a conversation, you are allowed to be honest. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to protect the peace you worked hard to rebuild. Real reconciliation, in any relationship, is not created by pretending nothing happened. It is created when truth and accountability finally occupy the same room. Your soulmate was beginning to learn that. Because another unexpected piece of information soon reached them, and this one did not come through conversation. It came through something they saw. Something small. Something that proved you had once protected them when they believed you were trying to cause trouble. Perhaps it was a message you never intended them to read. Perhaps it was something someone finally admitted. Perhaps they learned that during a moment when you could have exposed something embarrassing about them, you chose silence. You had an opportunity to defend yourself by revealing information that would have damaged their reputation, yet you did not. Why? Because even while misunderstood, some part of you still cared about their dignity. When your soulmate discovered this, the entire story turned upside down. They sat with the realization longer than anyone knew. The person they had been warned against had protected them. The person described as dangerous had shown restraint. The person accused of hidden motives had chosen not to use sensitive information as a weapon, even when doing so might have cleared their own name. That truth reached a place no explanation could have reached. And for the first time, your soulmate felt something deeper than regret. They felt grief. Grief for lost time. Grief for conversations that could have happened. Grief for the version of you they had almost believed. Grief for the possibility that you had been carrying the pain of being misread in silence. But beneath that grief, something else was growing. Determination. Your soulmate no longer wanted second-hand answers. They wanted the truth directly. They wanted to understand what you experienced. They wanted to know what you felt when the distance began. They wanted to know whether you had noticed the change. They wanted to ask whether you had ever considered walking away completely. And there was one question burning stronger than all the others. Do they still feel what I feel? They had not spoken it aloud yet. But heaven had heard it in the silence. The fascinating thing, beloved, is that the person who once warned them to stay away began sensing that their influence was nearly gone. And when people fear losing control of a narrative, they sometimes reveal more than they intend. That is exactly what happened. During one final conversation, the warning person said something they should never have said. One sentence. One detail. Something your soulmate immediately recognized could not be true. They stopped. They asked the person to repeat it. The atmosphere changed. Because your soulmate suddenly remembered where that detail had originally come from, and they knew with absolute certainty that the warning person had altered it. For the first time, there was no ambiguity. No interpretation. No confusion. They had proof. The story had been manipulated. Your soulmate's heart began pounding, not simply because they realized they had been misled, but because they immediately understood what the manipulation had cost. It had cost closeness with you. It had cost trust. It had cost time. And now they wanted to know why. Why had this person worked so hard to separate them from you? Why was your connection threatening enough to inspire distortion? What were they afraid would happen if your soulmate got close enough to see you clearly? Your soulmate asked. The person tried to avoid the question. They changed the subject. Your soulmate asked again. And this time, the person's expression revealed something before their words ever did. There it was. The real reason. Not the excuse. Not the warning. Not the story about protecting your soulmate. The reason beneath the reason. And when your soulmate finally heard it, they understood that this had never truly been about your character at all. It had been about what your presence awakened in them. Because ever since you entered their emotional world, your soulmate had begun changing. They were asking harder questions. They were recognizing unhealthy dynamics they once accepted. They were learning that love should not require constant fear, control, or approval. They were becoming more willing to trust their own inner voice. And someone did not want that transformation to happen. Your soulmate stared at the person differently now. Everything clicked. Every warning. Every exaggerated story. Every strange reaction. Every attempt to convince them that you were the problem. But what your soulmate did next surprised even the person standing in front of them. They did not argue. They did not shout. They became calm. The kind of calm that arrives when confusion finally ends. They simply said, "I need to speak to them myself." The room went still. Because everyone understood who "them" meant. You. Your soulmate had made a decision. No more intermediaries. No more borrowed opinions. No more allowing anyone else to define a connection they had never personally experienced. They wanted to come to you. But just as they were preparing to take that step, something happened that neither they nor the person who warned them expected. A new truth surfaced. A truth connected to the very first day the warning began. And this truth revealed that the person had not started interfering when your soulmate became interested in you. They had been watching the connection even earlier. They had noticed something before your soulmate consciously understood it themselves. Something about the way your soulmate changed when your name was mentioned. Something about the way they looked at you. Something about the future they quietly began imagining. And there was a reason that frightened this person enough to interfere before the connection could deepen. Your soulmate was about to discover exactly what that reason was. But the moment they learned it, they also discovered something else, something about you that had been hidden from them all along. Something you had done in silence. Something that proved your feelings had been far more sincere than they ever knew. And when the evidence finally reached their hands, your soulmate stared at it in complete disbelief, because written there in front of them was the one truth nobody had wanted them to see. There are moments when truth does not arrive like thunder. It arrives quietly, almost gently, and yet the moment it enters the heart, everything that existed before it begins to rearrange itself. That was exactly what happened when your soulmate looked at what had finally reached their hands. For several seconds, they could not move. They could not dismiss it, reinterpret it, or hide behind the warnings they had heard. The evidence was too clear. And suddenly, the person they had been encouraged to fear looked completely different through the eyes of truth. You were not the person they had been warned about. In fact, the truth revealed something far more emotional. While others were questioning your intentions, you had been protecting something precious without asking for recognition. What your soulmate discovered was not some dramatic declaration you had created to impress them. That was what made it so powerful. It was something you never expected them to see. Something done when there was no applause waiting for you, no reward, no guarantee they would ever understand. At some point during the confusion between you, you had been given an opportunity to speak badly about them, expose something private, or use information to make yourself appear innocent. You could have made yourself look better by making them look worse. Yet you chose not to. You protected their dignity even while your own intentions were being questioned. And when your soulmate realized this, one thought entered their mind with painful clarity: why would someone trying to hurt me protect me when I was not even there to see it? That question shattered the last remaining piece of the false story. Your soulmate went back through everything again. Every conversation. Every warning. Every moment when someone told them that you could not be trusted. But now those memories looked different because they were viewing them through what they had personally discovered rather than what they had been instructed to believe. They remembered the warning person insisting that you always had hidden motives. Yet if recognition had been your motive, why had you done good things silently? They had been told you wanted control, yet you had repeatedly given them freedom. They had been told you would eventually embarrass them, yet when you had the perfect opportunity to do exactly that, you protected them instead. Something deeper than logic began awakening inside them. Regret. Not the shallow regret of simply making a mistake. This was the kind that forces a person to look honestly at themselves. Your soulmate began remembering every time they had treated you differently because of somebody else's opinion. They remembered conversations where they had held something back. Moments when they almost opened their heart and then became guarded. Times when you probably sensed the wall between you but had no idea who had built it. And then they remembered your eyes. There had been a moment, perhaps brief, when you looked at them as though you were trying to understand why they had suddenly become distant. You did not accuse them. You did not demand answers. You simply seemed confused, perhaps slightly wounded, and then you respected the distance they were creating. That memory hurt them now. Because they finally understood what you could not understand then. You were being punished for a story you had never been allowed to hear. Your soulmate sat alone with that realization. The room around them felt unusually quiet. Their mind wanted to escape the discomfort, but their heart refused. For the first time, they allowed themselves to imagine the situation from your perspective. Imagine caring about someone and suddenly feeling them pull away. Imagine sensing distrust without knowing what you had supposedly done. Imagine wondering whether you had become too vulnerable, whether your kindness had been mistaken for weakness, whether you should stop caring before caring cost you more. And something inside your soulmate whispered, they may have gone through all of that because I believed someone else before asking them. They closed their eyes. Your name came into their mind. Not the version of you created by gossip. You. The person they had actually experienced. And that distinction became impossible to ignore. But there was still another secret hiding beneath everything, and your soulmate knew it. The warning person had admitted enough to reveal manipulation, but they had not explained why they became involved so early. Remember, they had noticed your connection before your soulmate fully understood it themselves. They had recognized something developing, something they feared would change the balance of your soulmate's life. So your soulmate went back for the answer. This time, they did not approach the conversation emotionally. They approached it with an unusual calm. That calm frightened the other person more than anger would have, because anger can be redirected. Calmness backed by evidence is much harder to manipulate. Your soulmate asked, "When did you first decide there was something wrong with them?" The person hesitated. They gave a vague answer. Your soulmate asked again. "When?" Another pause. And then a date, a gathering, a conversation, or a particular moment was mentioned. Your soulmate immediately knew something was wrong. Because at that point, you and your soulmate had barely developed anything that could reasonably justify such a strong warning. That meant the warning had begun before there was anything to warn against. Think about that. Your soulmate did. And suddenly the question changed from, "What did you think was wrong with them?" to, "What did you see happening between us that made you afraid?" The other person's expression changed. That was the moment the deeper truth started coming out. They had seen how your soulmate behaved around you. They noticed that your soulmate listened differently when you spoke. They noticed an unusual softness. They noticed that someone who normally protected their emotions carefully seemed unable to hide certain reactions around you. They saw your soulmate becoming curious about things they had previously ignored. They watched them question choices, patterns, and relationships they had accepted for years. You were not controlling your soulmate. You were awakening something in them. And that was precisely the problem. Because the person warning them had grown accustomed to having a certain kind of influence. Perhaps your soulmate regularly asked for their approval. Perhaps they relied on their opinion before making important emotional decisions. Perhaps this person had always been the voice your soulmate trusted when they doubted themselves. Then you appeared, and something unexpected happened. Your soulmate started trusting their own heart. Not because you told them to reject anyone. Not because you demanded loyalty. Simply because the connection with you made them reflect more deeply. You asked questions without realizing how powerful those questions were. You encouraged them without trying to become their savior. You saw qualities in them that perhaps others benefited from keeping hidden. And when someone has spent years convincing another person that they cannot trust themselves, the arrival of someone who quietly reminds them of their own strength can feel threatening. That was what the warning person feared. Not you. What your soulmate was becoming around you. When this truth came out, your soulmate became silent. The person tried to soften what they had admitted. They claimed they were only concerned. They said they had seen relationships change people before. They insisted they did not want your soulmate to get hurt. But your soulmate finally asked the question that had been waiting beneath everything. If you were protecting me, why did you have to change the truth? Silence. There was no satisfying answer. Because genuine protection does not require fabricated evidence. Your soulmate understood that now. And suddenly something extraordinary happened emotionally. The anger they expected to feel toward the person became secondary. Their strongest emotion was directed toward the time they had lost with you. They thought about reaching out. Their hand moved toward their phone. Your name was there. For a few seconds, they stared at it. They imagined typing something simple, "Can we talk?" Then they stopped. Not because they no longer wanted to speak. Because suddenly the weight of that conversation became real. What if you had moved forward? What if you no longer trusted them? What if the silence had taught you how to live without the connection? What if they had waited too long? Your soulmate began realizing that discovering the truth did not automatically erase the consequences of believing the lie. And that realization humbled them. They deleted the unfinished message. Then typed another. Deleted that one too. They wanted words strong enough to explain what had happened without sounding like they were avoiding responsibility. They did not want to simply say, "Someone told me things about you," because deep inside they knew that was not enough. Someone may have planted the doubt, but they had chosen to water it. They had chosen not to ask you directly. They had allowed fear to become stronger than curiosity. That part belonged to them. And for perhaps the first time, they were ready to own it. But while they were sitting there trying to decide what to say, another message arrived. Not from you. From someone connected to the situation. Your soulmate opened it casually, expecting nothing significant. Then they froze. Because the message contained another piece of information about the warning person, and this information revealed that the interference had gone further than your soulmate knew. It had not been one conversation. There had been multiple conversations. And suddenly your soulmate understood something about your heart that nobody had explained to them. You were not afraid of losing to another person. You were afraid of losing yourself trying to prove you deserved love. That understanding reached them deeply. They began seeing your boundaries not as rejection, but self-respect. Your silence not as indifference, but emotional discipline. Your unwillingness to chase not as lack of feeling, but perhaps the consequence of having learned that real love cannot be begged into existence. And somewhere inside that realization, your soulmate began missing you differently. Before, they missed your presence. Now they missed the opportunity to have understood you correctly. They wondered about the conversations you could have shared if fear had not interrupted them. They imagined moments that never happened. They remembered little things about you that suddenly felt precious. The way you explained something when you were passionate, the way your energy changed when you genuinely laughed, the moments you became quiet because you were thinking more deeply than you wanted anyone to know. The person they had tried to forget became more vivid with every truth they uncovered. And that is when your soulmate finally typed a message they did not delete. But before sending it, they read it repeatedly. It was not dramatic. It was honest. I learned something I should have learned much sooner. I owe you a conversation and an apology. I understand if you do not want either, but I don't want silence to be the final version of this story. Their finger hovered. Everything inside them became still. And then fear returned one last time. Not fear of you. Fear of your answer. Because now they understood that you held something they had once held. The choice. Your soulmate had once decided whether to move closer or step away. Now they realized you might be the one deciding whether they were allowed back into your emotional world. That reversal changed them. They did not want to approach you with entitlement. They did not want to assume that discovering the truth automatically gave them access to you again. For the first time, they were thinking not only about what they wanted from you, but what you might need from them. And that was growth. The connection had already changed them, even through distance. But before they could send the message, another memory surfaced. A memory connected to the warning person. There had been a day when your soulmate mentioned you casually, long before everything became complicated. They remembered the warning person's reaction clearly now. It had been too quick. Too sharp. Almost as though your name touched a nerve. Your soulmate suddenly realized the person may have known something about you before they ever admitted it. That possibility changed everything again. They began asking questions quietly. Not accusations. Questions. And one answer led to another until they discovered an old connection. Not necessarily the kind anyone would immediately suspect. But there had been history. The warning person had crossed paths with someone connected to your past. And through that connection, they had heard a version of an old story about you. Your soulmate initially thought this explained everything. Perhaps the warning person genuinely believed bad information. But then another detail appeared. They had later learned that the story was incomplete. And they had continued warning your soulmate anyway. That distinction mattered. A misunderstanding can be corrected. Choosing to preserve a misunderstanding after discovering the truth is something else entirely. Your soulmate felt betrayed. Because the person had not simply been wrong. They had been given opportunities to reconsider. They refused. Why? The answer returned to the same uncomfortable truth. By then, keeping your soulmate away from you had become personally important to them. Your soulmate confronted this carefully. They said, "You knew there was another side." The person denied it. Your soulmate revealed what they had discovered. Silence again. Then came excuses. But excuses were no longer enough. And finally, the person said something unexpected. Something that stopped your soulmate completely. They admitted that after watching the two of you together, they became convinced that if your connection deepened, your soulmate would no longer need them in the same way. There it was. The truth beneath everything. Fear of being replaced. Fear of losing importance. Fear disguised as protection. Your soulmate did not celebrate this revelation. They felt sadness. Because they cared about this person. That was why the warnings had mattered in the first place. They had trusted them. They may still care about them despite what happened. Human relationships are complicated like that. Someone can act from insecurity and still matter to you. But caring about someone does not require allowing their fear to control your life. Your soulmate finally understood this. They said something quietly. "You could have told me you were afraid." Those words changed the entire conversation. Because suddenly the battle was no longer you against this person. It was truth against fear. And your soulmate chose truth. Not blindly choosing you. Choosing the right to discover you for themselves. That difference matters. Because genuine connection cannot be built on fantasy any more than it can be destroyed by gossip. Your soulmate needed to know the real you, including your imperfections, your fears, your complicated edges. They no longer wanted a perfect version of you. They wanted an honest one. And for the first time, they were prepared to offer you the same. No games. No secret tests. No outside voices deciding what two hearts should say to one another. They picked up their phone again. The message was still waiting. Their finger moved toward send. But something stopped them. A notification. A name. Someone they had not expected to hear from. The person who contacted them had direct knowledge of your past, and apparently they had heard that your soulmate was finally questioning the old story. Your soulmate opened the message. The first sentence said, "There is something about them you deserve to know before you contact them." For one terrible second, all the old fear returned. Was there another secret? Had the warning been partially right after all? Your soulmate's heart raced as they continued reading. But the next lines did not accuse you. They defended you. This person explained something you had never told your soulmate because you did not want sympathy. There had been a period in your life when you carried something difficult alone. You had been misunderstood before. Someone you trusted had once taken your vulnerability and turned it into a story that made you look like the problem. That experience changed the way you approached closeness. It taught you to become careful with your heart. Suddenly, your soulmate understood why their distance may have hurt you more deeply than they realized. This was not the first time someone had believed a distorted story about you. And still, you had not become cruel. Still, you had tried to remain open. Still, you had offered sincerity. Your soulmate covered their face. Because now they understood something painful. By believing the warning without speaking to you, they had accidentally repeated a wound you had already survived. That realization brought tears closer than anything else had. They whispered your name. And for the first time, the question was not, why didn't they explain themselves? It was, why should they have had to? You should not have needed to defend yourself against accusations nobody had even told you existed. Your soulmate understood that now. They returned to the message they had written. But it no longer felt sufficient. "I owe you an apology" was true. It was simply not enough. So they began writing again. This time, slowly. They admitted they had listened to someone else. They admitted they had doubted their own experience. They admitted that their distance was not your imagination. And most importantly, they did not blame the warning person for every decision. They wrote, "Someone influenced me, but I allowed that influence. I should have spoken to you. I should have asked you. I should have trusted what I had actually experienced instead of becoming afraid of what might happen." They stopped typing. Then added one final sentence. "I don't know what you feel anymore, but I finally know what I was afraid to admit about what I feel." Your soulmate stared at those words. Because once written, they could no longer pretend. The warning had not worked simply because they were afraid you might hurt them. It had worked because their feelings for you were already stronger than they were prepared to face. The deeper the connection felt, the more frightening the possibility of losing it became. So when someone offered them a reason to run before they could be hurt, fear accepted the invitation. That was the truth your soulmate had avoided. They did not stay away because they felt nothing. They stayed away because feeling something real made them vulnerable. And now there was nowhere left to hide from that. But just before they pressed send, they received one final piece of information. This one was different. It was not about the warning person. It was about you. Something had happened recently. Something your soulmate did not know. Someone had spoken to you about them. Your soulmate learned that you had been asked a direct question: if they ever returned with the truth, would you hear them out? And apparently, you had answered. Your soulmate's heart began racing as they waited to hear exactly what you had said. Because your answer would determine whether the message sitting unfinished on their screen represented a new beginning, or words that had arrived one moment too late.